I want you to hit me as hard as you can.
With Spider-Man No Way Home recently hitting theaters, and the news that Tom Holland will be doing 3 more Spider-Man films, I felt it was only appropriate that we speak about another Spider-Man property. A series about our favorite webhead that defines Spider-Man for my generation. Spider-Man the Animated Series on Fox Kids. While there were some Spider-Man cartoons before the premiere of this series in 1994, it was this show that introduced many aspects from the comics that had not yet been touched upon in adaptations. Don't get me wrong, I was a fan of all those previous Spider-Man cartoons that kicked off Marvel's animation adventures. It was just that this series made my love of Spider-Man grow. It wasn't just the cool rogues gallery of villains or the awesome action, but also the emphasis on Peter Parker's personal life. Whether it was his love life or his money issues, it was a show just as much about Peter Parker as it was Spider-Man. The show's stories were ripped out of the classic run on Amazing Spider-Man, written by Stan Lee and John Romita Sr. Romita was the key ingredient behind the Webhead's college adventures, as well as defining the love of Peter's life, Mary Jane Parker. He'd also co-create such iconic villains as Rhino and the Shocker. While the previous Spidey cartoons were fun, it was this series that brought maturity to the character. Most folks cite Batman the Animated Series as being groundbreaking in animation storytelling, but I think this show is just as important. I may not be too happy with the current status of Marvel's animation endeavors. Some have succeeded, others have just not been my cup of tea, but you can't deny that this show is the benchmark from which all those Marvel animation shows stem. But let's take a swing on our web and ask ourselves the questions we always ask on this show. Is it as good as I remember? Does it still hold up? And most importantly, should the show come back? Well, let's find out in this spectacular episode of Gone, but Not Forgotten. Thanks for watching Gone But Not Forgotten. If you enjoy our shows, please subscribe to our channel right now, like this video, and click on the bell so you can be notified each time a new video goes up. Now, back to the show. Stan Lee had wanted to do a new Spider-Man series for years, after the end of Spider-Man and His Amazing Friends in 1983. So it was high time in the early 90s that Marvel revisit the animation world. In 1992, the X-Men animated series was a huge success, so it was inevitable that Marvel's flagship title, The Amazing Spider-Man, would soon follow. At the time, Marvel was facing bankruptcy, and needed a big hit to save them from their fate. Enter Israeli-American businessman and controversial figure, Avi Arad. I have to be honest, I am not the biggest fan of Avi Arad. I think for all the good he's done for Marvel, he's also been its biggest hurdle to overcome. But I must admit, he is responsible for the MCU's inception, and he is a smart businessman. Arad wanted to make a Spider-Man cartoon that would sell toys, as he was the CEO of Toy Biz and had a vested interest in making fertile ground for new customers. Stan Lee himself was heavily involved at the beginning of the series, since he wanted to make a show that was closer to the comics. This is when they hired Martin Pasco from Batman the Animated Series. The studio was very confident in Pasco's abilities from his work on Batman, but in his 2 months on the job, no scripts were written, and very little had been done. Pasco was then fired, and a panicked Stan Lee called John Semper Jr., whom Stan had met years ago when John worked at a different company called Marvel Productions. Lee knew that Semper was a fan of the Spidey comics, and he could trust him to create a good story rather than giving the bare minimum. When Semper got to the show, he was shocked to see that nothing had been done. The only things that were established at this point was that the focus would be on Spider-Man's college years, and that Hobgoblin was going to be a big antagonist. And Semper hated that. He felt it made no sense that the Green Goblin would come in second to Hobgoblin, whom he felt was a boring character that had no real depth to him. But Arad had already made the Hobgoblin toy, so that was non-negotiable. Semper eventually made it work by introducing the man behind Hobgoblin's equipment and origin, Norman Osborn. Eventually he would wind up writing, co-writing, or doing the story for all the scripts except for 5 for the entirety of the series. At first, Semper brought in comic book writers to the show, but that did not work out because comic book writers just couldn't adapt to the stress of writing for TV animation, as it involves a lot of strict deadlines and heavy revision due to network supervision. At this point, Semper decided to bring in some amazing writers: Mark Hofmeyer, Stan Berkowitz, Jim Creed, and Ernie Altbacker. These guys turned in some of my favorite scripts of the show, such as The Alien Costume, the 3-part episode that introduced Venom, and the 2-part Daredevil episodes Framed and Man Without Fear, as well as my personal favorite episode, Make a Wish, based off the comic book issues of Amazing Fantasy number 15 and The Amazing Spider-Man numbers 55 and 248. The basic story of the episode is that Spider-Man meets a little girl whom he tells his origin to. It's a simple but very touching story that has an interesting take on how Peter came up with his idea for web fluid. You folks out there should check it out. Oddly enough, Semper's work was inspired by Seinfeld, a TV sitcom which had featured multiple storylines. It inspired both he and Stan Lee to make the Spider-Man show multi-layered, and the network was not happy with this. And despite the network's objections to his approach, Semper did it anyway, even if he was almost fired from the show because of it. Avi Arad was also very difficult to work with, as he was always trying to push toys onto the series. For example, Avi once told writer Mark Hofmeyer that he had to put in a Spider-Man Corvette because he was about to release the toy to the public. This drove Hofmeyer insane, but eventually he would make it work. Arad also didn't have a sense of humor, as he almost fired Mark over this little story.
We were talking about the Venom episode, and we were trying to figure out what big Sonic event could happen to get the symbiote to separate from Spider-Man.
Right.
And so we had talked about, well, I think in the original comic, he's in a bell tower, right? It's the Sonics of the bell shaking, right?
Yeah.
So we were like, well, that's very quaint in 60s, or 70s. And so we decided it would be a rocket launch, because that's the sort of the ultimate annoyance. It would be a rocket launch, and we were trying to figure out how does Spider-Man signal that he's going to whatever, the launch site to do this. And I remember Avi said, well, perhaps Spider-Man could say, the launch.
The lunch.
And so then lunchtime rolled around, and it was all time to eat, and somebody said, well, what are we going to do now? And I said, how about the lunch?
Now, of course, I can't talk about this series without mentioning the amazing voice cast, which had such staples of voice acting as Mark Hamill in the role of Hobgoblin. Hamill did something a little different with his portrayal of Hobgoblin, as his voice was a lot like the Joker, but did not have the same laugh. Hobgoblin's laugh was more unique, not as over-the-top as the Joker's laugh on Batman. The biggest example of his subtlety is when you first meet the civilian identity of Hobgoblin, Jason Philip Macendale. His voice as Macendale is vastly different, but if you pay close attention, you can hear a hint of Hobgoblin.
Oh, marvelous. I hoped we might be able to get through one day without some kind of spider coming between us. No, you failed to tell me Spider-Man would get involved.
This is yet another example as to why Mark Hamill is an amazing voice actor. There were also plenty of other veteran voice actors in the cast, such as Neil Ross, Jennifer Hale, and Hank Azaria. Certain actors made me always think of them as the definitive voices of my favorite Spidey characters. I always heard Roscoe Lee Brown's voice as the Kingpin whenever I read a comic book, at least until Netflix's Daredevil show came along. Just like how I always thought that J. Jonah Jameson's voice should be Ed Asner until J.K. Simmons played him in Sam Raimi's Spider-Man. However, I still envision the voice of Mary Jane as that of Saratoga Ballantyne. And I hope that never changes, because she was perfect in the role. Finally, we've got to talk about the voice of our friendly neighborhood Spider-Man, Christopher Daniel Barnes. You would probably recognize Barnes' voice as Prince Eric from The Little Mermaid, and he was perfect as the famed wall crawler. I think he was the only actor who could pull off that much narration on a TV show. His voice could make you laugh 1 minute with his quick quips.
When Spider-Man meets his demise, you'll have the privilege of sharing his fate.
Can't you pry this thing off?
You want a trial separation already? I understand, but I'm hurt.
But then make you sad with his tenderness whenever he spoke to Aunt May. It was interesting seeing the range of his vocal performance, such as that moment where he goes nuts on the Shocker while being possessed by the alien costume.
No! What are you trying? No. I give up. Come on. You're supposed to be the good guy. You can't do this!
Why not? I have the power.
I can only hope that one day Barnes has a voice cameo in one of the Spider-Verse films. Now, a big hurdle that the show faced was its level of censorship. It wasn't just them though, it was all cartoons in general at the time, and you can thank the Power Rangers for that. At the time, parents were complaining about the level of violence that kids were being exposed to through the programming on Fox Kids. So Fox overreacted and began to heavily censor all cartoons with ridiculous notes. For example, Spider-Man could not punch anyone. Characters were not allowed to say words like die, death, or kill. Instead, they could say destroyed or allude to death, but not flat out state that someone had died. The character of Morbius, the living vampire, was not allowed to suck the character's blood through his fangs. So he sucked the blood through suction cups that were on the palms of his hands. Additionally, Morbius and other characters were not allowed to say the word blood. The word plasma was used in its place. When the Sinister Six was introduced onto the show, the team had to be renamed the Insidious Six, because network censors thought that the word sinister sounded too frightening. And that's strange because at the same time, the X-Men cartoon was using a character named Mr. Sinister. Things got even dumber from here. The crew was told that whenever Spider-Man landed on a roof, that they made sure he doesn't harm any pigeons. And they could have a villain sent to jail, but could not give him a bus ticket and send him to Florida. Whatever the hell that means. But Semper didn't think his show was censored any more than others. Sometimes he either ignored the notes or incorporated them the best that he could. The one time he did fight the censors heavily was when the network wanted to remove the trademark horns on Daredevil. They had to sit and have a conversation with the network heads to explain to them that Daredevil was not actually a devil. The director of the majority of the episodes, Bob Richardson, revealed in an interview that broadcast standards and practices told him that Batman the Animated Series wasn't censored as much as Spider-Man the Animated Series, because Batman was set in a world that resembled the 1930s and had a much more cartoony look, as opposed to Spider-Man, which they felt was more modern and realistic. The show's animation style was mostly hand-drawn, but did feature CGI at times to help them cut costs. Something Semper wanted was to have the streets of New York City on the show be populated with people and cars. One thing I always wondered about the animation was whether they intended Peter Parker to look a bit like the 1970s Spider-Man, Nicholas Hammond. But it turns out that's only a coincidence. As I stated earlier, Avi Arad was a huge problem for the crew of Spider-Man, because he would piss off the network with his ego. He bragged about making a Ghost Rider show for UPN, so Semper was told that he could not use Ghost Rider on their show, since they didn't want to promote a show on another network. He also fought Semper on using Madame Web on the show. Semper wanted to use her because he wanted Stan Lee's wife, Joan Lee, to do the voice for Madame Web. But Arad said he could not make a toy out of some, quote, old broad. However, Semper eventually won this fight and says he has the Madame Web toy on his wall to this very day. Sadly, it was Arad that would lead to the cancellation of the Spider-Man animated show. The network head, Margaret Loesch, hated Avi Arad. Arad antagonized her so much that when the show was up for renewal, she swiftly canceled it. Think about that for a second. You have a show with high ratings that is still making money, and you hate someone on the show's crew that much that you would rather scrap a profitable show instead of working with that person ever again. Still, the ending of the show was pretty epic. It featured a war between an alternate insane Peter Parker called Spider Carnage, who was trying to destroy all of the multiverses. Semper came up with the idea of introducing multiple Spider-Men because he said it was his way to help fans of the show. Whenever Semper was a kid, he always hated buying a toy that would never be featured on a show he liked. So by making multiple Spider-Men, he could incorporate those toys that were not part of the main series. This way, the kids would not feel ripped off. I was one of those kids. I cannot tell you how annoying it was buying the Ninja Turtle toys that were either never featured on the show or were completely different than the description on the box. So to Mr. Semper, I say thank you for this, sir. You are a class act. And in fact, it was this plot device that has been cited as the inspiration for the incredible movie Into the Spider-Verse. One thing many fans of the show are still unhappy about was the fate of Mary Jane. During the series, Mary Jane fell into a portal and disappeared, thus preventing us from getting a real resolution with her storyline. In the last episode, Madam Web tells Peter that she's going to help him find her, but before that could happen, the show was cancelled. So Semper never got to tell that story. However, he did write a script that demonstrates what he would have done. The script involves Mary Jane in Victorian England and Carnage as Jack the Ripper. You can read the script for yourself online, so I highly suggest you check it out. So, should this show come back? Hell yeah! And considering that Disney Plus has recently confirmed the return of the X-Men 97, perhaps an official word of the return for Spider-Man 98 will not be too far behind? One can only hope. Still, if you want to take a swing down memory lane, or just want to see what the big deal is about this show, you can stream all 65 episodes for yourself on Disney+. So tonight, why don't you sit back, relax, listen to that awesome theme song written by Joe Perry from Aerosmith, and get ready to be caught up in the web of Spider-Man 98. I promise you folks that you're gonna have an amazing time.
1, 2, 3, 4. The itsy bitsy spider went up the water spout. Down came the rain and washed the spider out. Out came the sun and dried up all the rain. And the itsy bitsy spider went up the spout again. Itsy bitsy spider, itsy bitsy spider, itsy bitsy spider. Itsy bitsy spider, itsy bitsy spider, itsy bitsy spider. Went up the spout, the itsy bitsy spider went up the water spout. Down came the rain and washed the spider out. Out came the sun and dried up all the rain. And the itsy bitsy spider went up the spout again.
I'm Jesse Shade speaking on behalf of David Arroyo for JoBlo.com, and thanks again for watching our show. If you like what you see, please subscribe to the JoBlo Originals channel. Tell all your friends who like this sort of content, and turn on the bell to receive notifications for all of our latest videos. We are an independent company that appreciates all of your support, and we will be seeing you next time for the next installment of Gone, But Not Forgotten.